All right, so this morning, of course, the Auditor General confirmed something that I think we've all been very aware of over the last 3 years, and that there's a significant problem within Canada's asylum system, specifically with regard to the time delays it takes to process applications. A 71,000 case backlog with the Auditor General stating that it will continue to grow with the current demands on the system, as well as the current funding levels and productivity levels is unacceptable. So briefly, what I'd like to do is just quickly debunk the Minister's talking points and then talk about what I'm sure you're all going to ask us: what would we do differently? First of all, I cannot believe that, like, 6 weeks left in Parliament after 4 years, that they're coming out here and saying that it's Stephen Harper's fault. That's just patently ridiculous, especially given that the Auditor General's report itself talks that it actually states that under the previous Conservative government, the IRB was able to process all the claims under the legislative timelines, and that it was only under this government that those timelines were abandoned. That is just patently ridiculous to me, and actually this government should be taking responsibility for that issue. So, debunk number one. Number two, with regard to funding, the Auditor General themselves today said that throwing more money at the situation is not going to solve the problem. And I think that was confirmed by the Minister today, saying that he couldn't answer the question on when the backlogs would be cleared. And funding itself is not a metric. The metric were included in the Parliamentary Budget Officer report. They were included in the AG here. It's actually reducing those wait times. So while I'm sure that the Liberals' plan, quote unquote, is more expensive, the reality is that we had better processing timelines in the previous government. The other thing I'll point out is that the 2019 budget had no information with regard to funding on this particular issue. The other thing that the Minister said with regard to funding is that the system was not set up for the volumes they received. Well, that's right. Absolutely. This government has done nothing to address the situation that has placed demand on the system, the Roxham Road issue, and also another emergent issue, which will be coming up in coming days, is the number of asylum claims coming from Mexico under the visa restriction. And I believe that number is over 1,000 in the first 2 months of this year. And finally, I'm glad of one thing that this government has departed from its top-line messaging over the last 3 years, is that it's fear-mongering to talk about that. So some positivity. What will fix the problem? We need to reduce the demand on the system. That's just the reality. And even with 65 million people on the move around the world, I do not subscribe to the belief that somebody who has reached upstate New York has the same level of validity in an asylum claim as other people around the world. The reality is that we have to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. The Division 16 of the Budget Implementation Act has been resoundingly panned by every corner of the immigration community in Canada. It's even estimated that itself, if it somehow managed to hold up a court challenge, would only affect 10% of the applications that have come forward under the Express Entry program at Roxham Road. And frankly, we need to look at things like the visa lift. The fact that the government lifted visa requirements on countries that we knew placed demand on the system, like Mexico, without a formal plan in place, of course that's going to put demand on the asylum claim system. So we have to deal with that. We have to have a conversation about who is prioritized in this country through the asylum claim system. That is something that the government has departed from. We need a plan with a timeline to clear the backlogs. Unfortunately, I'm not sitting in the Minister's chair as of right now, and I think that without having any understanding on just how deep the backlogs are or the level of incompetency that the system is being managed with, it's difficult for me to give you a timeline, but the reality is that the backlog being 5 years is creating a pull onto our system, and that is going to make things worse. And frankly, I will close with this on how to fix the problem. We have to stop dismissing systemic injustices and inefficiencies within our immigration system and a policy discussion on that down to racism. This government has to take responsibility for this program. In closing, I'd like to, something that didn't come up in the minister's remarks was the call center timelines with regard to immigration. The BIA has Division 15, which relates to the immigration consultant oversight body. The statistics in this Auditor General's report, 70% were clients were prevented from reaching an agent. And that there was a 32-minute wait time with no service standards. We have had people tell us that they have to use immigration consultants because they can't access services from the government. And the government is spending $51 million on this oversight body for immigration consultants instead of fixing these systemic issues. There's a problem there. So we have a lot of work to do, and the government needs to take accountability. And I didn't hear anything in the minister's statement today suggesting that that was something even remotely on the table.
David Thornton, CBC.
You didn't mention anything about and maybe I'm wrong here, the gaps in security when it comes to processing asylum seekers. What would your government do differently if you're elected?
Well, I think the question that came up about why it didn't trigger an audit is really important. I think we need to have an understanding. I believe that the framework that we have in Canada for screening people is fairly solid. It's just a matter of applying it, especially given the demands on the system. I think that that audit should have occurred. We need to have more data, but I guess I'm concerned with sort of the blasé attitude that, like, what is still a significant margin of error, I think it was 400 cases that were cited, is somehow insignificant, right? The Canadian public relies on that number being close to zero in order to ensure that there is broad support for immigration. So number one, acknowledge that there's a problem. Number two, ensure that there's an audit that's taking place and a continual like QA or quality assurance process, and take it seriously. I also think that we would have to put in place systems to ensure when those incidences come up that we're treating them seriously. And my colleague who has responsibility for public safety might want to speak more to that.
Not really. You answered the question, but you mean all the point about security. Normally when someone comes in Canada, it takes 8 hours to analyze who is the security checks, and actually CBSC cut to 2 hours because they don't have time to manage all the people who come in Canada. So it's a matter of security, and I think, like Michelle said, that Canadians expect that the government of Canada take the security of Canadian are responsible in face of Canadian, and so we must do what we have to do. If someone comes in Canada and we don't really know who is he or she, and then we have to keep them to make sure that we have the good information before that these people are free. When
it comes to the issue with call centers, it seems that the problem was building long before this government. It didn't just suddenly appear. What do you guys have to say about that?
Again, I mean, come on. This government's had 4 years to deal with this system, right? I kind of reject that it's somehow Stephen Harper's fault that 4 years in, the call center is something that they haven't looked at. This is an issue that has come up repeatedly in this Parliament in the context of looking at immigration consulting, the oversight and regulatory body for that, as well as in reviews of how a member of Parliament offices, the demand on our offices and our staff have increased in terms of casework. I think virtually every member of Parliament now has a full-time person who's just doing immigration casework, and that suggests that the system isn't working. I think that there is a disconnect within the immigration department itself. Somebody in our committee this morning put it this way: the people who are on the front lines want to simplify the process and make sure that it's easy to access information for people who are the end user. The policy people tend to try and complicate this. I would be if we form government in the fall, I think writ large we would be less focused on, essentially expanding a profession that provides services to backstop what the government should be doing in terms of simplicity. Even just some of the things today that were brought up, like why are we still faxing and mailing or carrier pigeoning information that could be done in a shorter period of time. So it's a problem that we have to take seriously because it is a problem for the end user, and that's really what we should be managing to is understanding that somebody who's applying into the system who needs that information. I don't get my calls returned. I can't imagine a new Canadian trying to navigate that system, and that's something we would take seriously.
Michelle Zilio, Globe and Mail.
So we're hearing a lot as we come to the end of this government's mandate, a lot about this cycle of blaming the Harper Conservatives for the backlog, and I can already hear it. When you guys probably come into power, you're going to have tens of thousands of cases in your backlog. So how are you going to ensure that that backlog gets down to zero so the cycle can come to an end?
Yeah, so I outlined some of that in my remarks. First of all, acknowledging that this is a problem. I think that that's only something that the government is starting to realize that they have to do right now, and I frankly think it's because this has all been about a political game for them, right? Rather than managing to compassion and fairness, this has been about how do we get political wins. So first of all, recognizing there's a problem. Second of all, I really believe that we have to reduce the demand on the system for people that are using the asylum system to enter Canada who don't have valid asylum claims and are looking at it to enter as low-skilled workers. This is why we've proposed, looking at programs like the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, where we have people entering the country year after year where there's stated demand based on labor market data, but people are coming to work and contribute to the Canadian economy, but don't have a pathway to residency. Let's look at that program to alter it, match it to the needs of the Canadian economy, ensure that people have a way to enter the country legally to become self-sufficient so that they're not abusing the asylum system, and then get really tough on people who are using the asylum system to make bogus claims. Another thing just to reiterate, I think the government has made serious errors in lifting visa requirements on countries where we've known that there are high levels of abuse without having a plan to deal with it. The numbers from Mexico over the last year are alarming. There are, and this is not, a slight to the Mexican people. It's just in 2009 we saw 9,000 bogus asylum claims, many of which were bogus. The current acceptance rates today for Mexican claims are about 22%. That's a lot lower than the average rate, which I think is over 50%. We need to not do stuff like that again. I've outlined other things in previous policy announcements. Work on a global system of safe third country agreements so that we have a legal framework internationally that upholds our responsibilities under the Geneva Convention, so that we're not, as what I suspect the Liberals have done with Division 16 in the BIA this year, created probably court challenges to the end of time, and not allow pulls into our asylum system. It's this self-perpetuating cycle, right, where these backlogs, people say, oh, I can stay here for 5 years, right, without my claim being heard. But at the end of the day, yes, of course, a Conservative government will have to clean up a Liberal mess. That is very unfortunate for the taxpayers and for people who want positive immigration policy. But we accept that responsibility, and that's why I'm campaigning on this being a problem, right? This is a problem. We will fix it. It's very clear from the minister's response today that they don't even have an intent to acknowledge that this is a problem.
Any other questions? Molly Thomas, CTV.
Mr. Rempel, you're playing the blame game. They're playing the blame game. No government official is creating the global crisis. So explain to me what the plan is. Like, what would you say to someone that is thinking of coming to Canada to seek asylum?
Sure. So first of all, I want to push back on the first part of the assertion that you just made about us playing the blame game. You had the minister sit up here on this stage and say it was Stephen Harper's fault. I have the Auditor General and the Parliamentary Budget Officer directly correlating the increase in asylum claims and the backlogs to Liberal government policy with regard to Roxham Road and lifting the visa requirement. So I don't accept that assertion, and I think it's unfair. I think that we're accepting the reality that we have to fix this system system so that somebody, and what I would say to somebody trying to come to this country is, if Canada supports a strong asylum system for the world's most vulnerable, this is why we have actively looked for immigration system changes for genocide victims, for members of marginalized communities, for example, the gay men who are being rounded up in concentration camps in Chechnya. That's what the asylum and refugee system was designed for in Canada. If you're coming to Canada as an economic immigrant, you want to come here and work or be self-sufficient, we have to ensure that there are pathways to enter that match labor intake to the needs of the Canadian economy. But don't come to Canada to abuse the asylum system. Just because there's delays and there are, instant access to benefits doesn't mean that the system was designed for a claim that doesn't have the basis in validity. And that is why we are strongly opposed to what's happening at the U.S.-Canada border, because again, somebody might disagree with me on this, but even the civil service, even Justin Trudeau has said the Safe Third Country Agreement still applies. The American government, regardless of your feeling of the American president, anyone's feeling on that, maintains a very vigorous and fair asylum system. And that is not what our asylum system was designed for. So that's the conversation I would have. People are welcome to come to Canada in an orderly, fair, and compassionate manner.
Do you have a follow-up, Molly? Anybody else?
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much.